Hello, everybody. My name is Eric Johnson, and I am a faculty member at Washington State University. Today, we're going to be talking about language, metaphors, and public discourse. So to start off, I'll give a little bit of background about metaphors and thought, metaphor theory, and then we'll get into how metaphors are used for discourse analysis purposes with multiple examples. And then we'll apply a metaphor analysis to the current discourse surrounding COVID-19 and specifically in educational contexts. And then at the end, I provide some further resources in case you're interested in reading more about how to do metaphor analysis on public discourse. So I draw heavily from George Lakoff and his work with metaphors. And essentially what we need to understand is that metaphors are about understanding concepts. They're used to describe different concepts that we want to know more about, but we use metaphors to create a better sense of our world around us. And so as you can see from the Lakoff and Turner quote, metaphors are more than just about words. They're about the depth of our understanding and experiences and how we understand our world around us. So to give an example, of metaphor analysis, I want to start off with something that's pretty basic that is in a lot of like song lyrics that you can go look in yourself. So you have things that say like, I'm crazy about her, she drives me out of my mind, he flipped out when she arrived. So you have these pieces, these examples of rhetoric, and you look at them and they all share something in common. First, they're talking about being crazy or being out of your mind or loss of emotional control. And on the other side of it, those are all expressions used to describe emotion and love. And so the way that you do a metaphor analysis is to find these different excerpts and look for the common feature. And in this case, you're talking about madness, right? So somebody that's insanity, or the way that it affects your mind. And you use that to talk about, in this case, love. And so when we do metaphor analysis, you look at source domains for these metaphors. And the source domain is something that you know a lot about, okay? It's something that you have experienced. And so in the examples on the previous page, we were talking about madness, okay? And so what that does is it enables you to apply the ontology of madness to describing something. So the ontology is like your lived experience, what you know about that concept. And so that entails rational actions, loss of self-control, being incoherent. And so that all of that is wrapped up in the source domain of a metaphor. Now, through the process of cognitive mapping, you then apply that source domain rhetorically to a target domain. And in the example that we just went over, those were all about love. And so you're trying to understand love in terms of madness. So that then produces these cognitive entailments, right? So people who are in love cannot control their emotions, they do strange things, they act irrationally. And that's how you're understanding the situation, right? Now, there are many different ways to describe love or whatever, but in this case, the source domain of madness really shapes the way you understand that particular concept. And now that's a basic example that you can find, like I said, in song lyrics or poems or whatever. But you can then take that same process and start looking at the rhetoric used in public discourse. So one text that really, really influenced me is Otto Santana's 2002 book, Brown Tide Rising, where he looked at the discourse in the Los Angeles newspapers surrounding immigration and minority communities. So I applied that same approach, looking at the Arizona media surrounding the debate around bilingual education in 2000. And ultimately, Arizona passed a law making bilingual education illegal. So I was interested in, what the newspapers were saying about bilingual education and students and minority communities and language. And so in these examples right here, you can see that, they're describing children like we're crippling our children, they're innocent Hispanic children, and we need to help our children. So in this example, you have the source domain of victims, right? And so students are being described as victims. Well, the ontology of victims is a very powerful concept to apply, right? Because we naturally want to help people who have been injured or powerless or whatever. And so when that's applied to students, then it creates an environment where bilingual education was the bad guy, was the adversary, and that was doing all this harm to the students. So by using that particular rhetorical strategy, um, the advocates of Proposition 203, which made bilingual ed illegal, were able to frame the debate in terms of helping students instead of giving them the opportunity to learn other languages or cultivate their own language. It was used to get voters to pass this law to make bilingual education illegal. Now, within that same time frame, you also had extensions on the discourse surrounding uh, you know, uh, bilingual education and immigration and linguistically diverse communities. And you had quite a few stories come out about immigration and describing immigrants as, a pathology in this case, where they were talking about the border being an open, bleeding wound and really creating a negative perspective towards immigrants. So on the other side of the debate, you also had English being described in positive terms and being the key to success, right? Or being framed as the most important component of keeping a united country. And so these metaphors are very powerful in public discourse when there is a topic being debated or discussed, and it helps shape public opinion. So another powerful metaphor that emerged was this notion of students as prisoners, right? And being trapped in bilingual programs, or in this particular quote from the chairperson of the Proposition 203 campaign, she was describing culture as a prison, right? And that's very revelatory in terms of what the underlying ideology was really about. It wasn't about supporting kids in their education. It was about deculturation, right? And removing cultures that are seen as prisons, essentially. So I've done other work in this area, for example, on the concept of a language gap. And with my colleagues, we did a metaphor analysis and looked at how, in one example, language was described in this metaphor as health, right? And so if somebody is sick or wounded or lacking nourishment, they need to be cured or helped. It's the same type of victim mentality that we just saw. And in this case, it was the debate is aimed at trying to change the way linguistically diverse communities speak and low-income communities interact. Again, these strategies are broad in terms of the different types of concepts that can be used and the topics that are described. So I've done a few things, nothing I've published, but I've done a few projects with students looking at discourse in our local area. And again, I'm from the state of Washington, and I live in a place called the Tri-Cities. So Washington has a very diverse community of immigrants and linguistically diverse individuals, especially in Eastern Washington, where I live. And so immigration continues to be a hot topic in the local area. And about 10 years ago, there was a candidate running for city council in the local area who was very pointed about his position on immigrants, um, to the extent that he was in favor of shooting immigrants and and kicking them out of the country and all of these horrible things. So you might want to pause the video for a second to read some of these statements. But the one strategy that he used about immigrants and framing them as invaders, and then showing how that he needed to protect the country, and then claiming that invading is illegal, but then connecting being illegal to raping, and saying that they're raping our country and they deserve a penalty. And then that ultimately led to his justification of why they should be shot. Again, this is horrible. And unfortunately, I mean, this individual did pass through the primary. He wasn't ultimately elected, but there was documented support for this position. And he's not the only one that has used these types of rhetorical strategies to garner support, as you're probably well aware of the comments that our current president made during his candidacy. And these were the comments he made in 2015. But again, you see, that immigrants are being framed in a negative way as rapists, as drug dealers, and that this is intentional, right? Now, when we look at COVID, I hadn't done this before, and so just in the past few days, reading through the local newspapers, and obviously listening to the news, national news, it really struck me how the use of numbers has been applied. Not that that's a bad thing, right? But it's very telling of the way that we understand this issue. And so numbers continue to be used in all sorts of different ways to describe the pandemic, to the point where that's then frames other arguments and other positions, using these quantitative approaches. So I checked out an article last night, and it was on India. India has an increase in the number of coronavirus cases. And within the first couple paragraphs, I was just struck by how many references to numbers, right? Total cases, number, lower, 100,000, 2 states of 128 million, 2 of 5, the most cases, 3,435,000, 2 states, 500. So just within this short excerpt, you can see the sheer number of references to quantity. And again, that's not to say that describing things with numbers is bad, but it's just very telling of how we understand the overall situation, right, with COVID. I also found some other pretty interesting references too. So, the number of individuals dying is huge, and a lot of times individuals and their stories they're not spoken about, right? They're referred to as a number. And in this case, it was real interesting the way that death and the death rate was described in terms of these geographical features. Like the quantity of population of a city, like Jerusalem or Austin. The death rate being 2.5 times the sea of humanity at Woodstock, or 4 times the number killed by this earthquake and tsunami in the Indian Ocean. So again, it's not that this isn't negative or bad in any way to describe something like this, but it just shows you how a situation is described in terms of something else, right? And that's the essence of a metaphor analysis. Now, something very common in our culture is to describe debates as conflict, right? Now that is the same strategy used whenever there's an adversary, and you often see that it's described in terms of a war. So this is probably the most common metaphor used outside of the numerical description. And these are just a couple excerpts. The COVID's described in terms of a fight, or in the second one, this individual was a veteran, and so they were applying his background as a veteran to fighting this other battle. And then you get things like the home front, and you could even extend this into weapons being vaccines, and that's referred to as an inheritance hierarchy metaphor when you have multiple different metaphors that feed into it. Again, not that that's not negative, it's just a way that we're understanding this current situation. So for me, I'm interested in context surrounding education. And one hot debate here, as in a lot of places, is schools not being open and students having to do distance learning and teachers having to do distance teaching, and all of the difficulties arising from that situation, right? And so that's been a major debate. And currently, that's the one that's talked about the most. Should schools open? Should they not? But there are some other interesting rhetorical strategies here using metaphors. And the one that I found that's most common is talking about doors, right? So kids receiving an education in a classroom is referred to in terms of the school doors being open or shut. And I would imagine if you did a search on school and education and COVID, you would see that this one is probably very prominent in your area as well. Another thing that has come up quite a bit, and this has to do with the numerical and the quantitative way that we describe the virus, is the description of this virus as a force, which is really interesting considering a virus, you don't feel it hit you or attack you. But the way it's described, like in this one, it's surging like a wave or a tsunami or something like that. But again, those types of expressions and metaphorical applications stem from our understanding as numerical and the war and the fight. And so, and this one was real interesting to me. This was from our Department of Health in the state of Washington. And so the director of our Department of Health was describing education in terms of health, right? And without education, without schooling, you have the risk of lower health. And anyway, so that reminded me of the work that I'd done on the language gap, right? And regarding something in terms of health and nutrition and access to those benefits enables you to couch whatever's blocking that as an adversary, right? And so that shows that this is another common metaphor that's used in these situations. So what I thought would be interesting is if you could, do a Google search for media articles on COVID in your area, right? Look at the metaphors being used in the rhetorical strategies to describe, the virus or communities, schools, parents, politicians. What are they? I mean, I'd be interested to see if between different regions they were similar or different, and especially considering the national discourse and how things are described. Are we feeding off of that, or is it more contextualized within an area? And then, look into another topic that's interesting to you. Right now, the politicians and debates and, the election and that's really dominating the national scene. But what else is out there maybe on a global level? What do you see from news in different countries? But if you can locate a topic in a story about it, look at how the authors use metaphor to describe the topic. Are certain sides being framed in a way to make them look benevolent? Are certain things being framed to make them look as adversaries? Anyways, I have a list of resources here that you can use to explore on a deeper level how metaphor analysis is conducted. And at least the stuff that I've done, if you send me an email, I'd be happy to shoot you those journal articles. But the other ones can be, retrieved from the library. Anyways, I appreciate your time and hope that you have some fun looking at the media articles and exploring the different metaphors that are being used. Okay.